So Judges chapter 7, verse 17. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. This is very early in the morning. It's still dark. And a watch has just changed at the enemy camp. Watch me, he told them. Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all round the camp blow your trumpets and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon and the 300 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they'd changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Bethshita, towards Zerara, as far as the border of Abel-Molah, near Tabbath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh were called out. They pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-bara." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-bara. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. He answered, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet kept up the pursuit and came to the Jordan and crossed it. They said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zimrilan, the kings of Midian." The officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zebulun in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" Gideon replied, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zebulun into my hands, I will tear your flesh with the desert thorns and briars." From there they went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered the same as the men of Succoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." Now Zebah and Zebulun were in Karkor. All these names, eh? It's one after another, isn't it? I'm sure I'm saying them wrong. With a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern people. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads, east of Nobah and Jogbeha. They attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zamulun, the kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zebulun and Zebulana, about whom you taunted me, saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zebulun in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?' And he took the elders of the town and taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with the desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town. Then he asked Zebah and Zebulun, 'What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?' 'Men like you,' they answered, 'each one with the bearing of a prince.' Gideon replied, 'Those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you.' Turning to Jephthah, his oldest son, he said, 'Kill them.' But Jephthah did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and afraid. Zebah and Zebulun said, 'Come to it yourselves. As is the man, so is his strength.' So Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' backs." What a rip-roaring story that is. Wow, man alive. Eh? Wow, that's a story. That's yeah. We're going to be here a long time. First heading. Overall title: Finishing the Work. The first heading I have is Fight and Flight. The 300 soldiers that God had left Gideon with, okay, because it was God. It was God that left Gideon with 300 soldiers. Obeyed the Lord in what seemed to be, humanly speaking, a futile plan. You've got 130,000 plus men. In your 300, what have you got? A jar, a torch, and a trumpet. That's it. It seems utterly futile. But as Gideon had been into the camp a little bit earlier, what he had learned was that the army was not as confident as it seemed. In fact, he had heard two of the guards talking, and one had had a dream about bread rolling down a hill and knocking over his tent, and he said, "This is Gideon." Now, this kind of fear is completely out of proportion. The Midianites were not in any way threatened by the Israelites. They were three times as large an army. They were fighting men. They had dominated for almost a decade. They were in many ways, they had no reason to fear, but they did fear. There was a fear. You can see God's already at work, and you can see how that works out. So when Gideon and his army surround the camp in three, they break into three cohorts, and they surround the camp. And then when they shout and blow their trumpets and reveal their lights, already the fear seems to be in the camp, and it breaks out. And the attack happens at the end of a watch. If you know anything about military warfare, the time to attack is between watches, when one lot are trying to wake up and another lot are ready to go to sleep, and everyone's a little bit caught off guard, So there's a lot of wisdom here, a lot of wisdom in what's happening. So as the guards are changing, then they make their attack. And in the darkness, or the beginning of the dawn light, the soldiers couldn't see each other. And of course, it was a huge army. They hardly knew each other. They were only there to get rich. They weren't there because they knew each other. They hardly, there were so many of them. And so in the dawn light, with all the chaos happening around them, with the fear in their hearts that I believe God gave them, and the confusion that's on around, they started to turn on each other. And they started to attack each other. And who's friend and who's foe? So there's a terrible battle takes place, and not a single Israelite has lifted the sword. Not a single Israelite has lifted the sword. Now, they all start running south, which is home, and they're all running down the valley, and they start to head home. At which point, the other tribes who went home previously, the previous day or a few days earlier, they're called out. And so what you see here in chapter 7 is that they're called back to the battlefield. So the great decisive moment has happened, and God has given the battle into Gideon's hands and into the 300's hands. And now the others are called back. God has won. No one can doubt it. God has won. And so now people come to pick up the pieces. And so that's what you see. Verse 24 of chapter 7, messengers throughout the hill country, they come down and they start to pursue the Midianites. But the first thing is how often we underestimate the strength of the enemy that's against the Church of Christ. Overestimate, not underestimate. How often sometimes we underestimate, but usually we overestimate. So we look at the world around us, for example, at this point in time, and we look at the church and we say, the world is so much stronger than the church. But actually, the world is not stronger than the church. The church is sustained and strengthened by God. The church is directed by God's word. The church knows why it's here and what it's here for, as do believers. They know where their resources are, they know where they're coming from, and they know where they're going. The church is incredibly strong. The world doesn't have a clue why it's here. It doesn't have a clue where it's come from. It doesn't have a clue where it's going. It doesn't have a clue. It doesn't have a clue what's right and wrong, as is becoming obvious at this point in time. And so while, as a church, we look around us and say, the world is very strong, well, in some ways it's large and dominant, but in other ways it's incredibly weak. If you put 20 Christians together with, say, 100 non-Christians, and you looked at their lives and you said, through COVID, how have you survived? Well, the 20 Christians should say, I've survived because I know where I'm from, I know where I'm going, I know who's with me, and I know how I'm going to get there. I know why I'm here on this planet, and I know that everything is in God's hands. Well, you ask the others of the world, how have you survived? Well, at best, they'll have tried to protect themselves, maybe tried not to think about the real issues that are at stake. Incredibly weak. When things go wrong, what you find out is that people are incredibly weak because they have no real resources. So here's the Midianite army. They look huge. But they don't really know why they're there or what they're there for, except to pillage. Israel knows why it's there. Israel knows that it's there because God's placed it there. Israel knows that it's only there because God keeps it there. Israel knows that they should be living their lives to the glory of God. Israel knows that God is with them. So in many ways, they're in a stronger position. We don't really need to be afraid of the world or what the world thinks. Because we know why we're here. We know where we're from. We know where we're going. We know who's with us. We're in a much stronger position in that way than the world. So even in our own lifetimes, and I'm going to include me, we would have thought, 25 years ago, that the Soviet Union were powerful, that they were going to dominate for 100, maybe 1,000 years. And in a moment, over the course of a year, it completely collapsed. The whole thing just completely collapsed. And we were shocked. We were shocked. The Berlin Wall came down, and then it was glasnost, and then suddenly Poland was free and doing what it wanted, and Estonia was free and doing what it wanted. Ukraine was free and doing what it wanted, and what we feared was an incredibly powerful and mighty civilization was revealed to be very, very weak. Now, at the moment, we could maybe look and see the same true of, say, China at this point in time. They look incredibly powerful, but they're not. They don't know why they're here. They don't know where they're from. They don't know where they're going, except lots of Chinese are becoming Christians, so that's going to change the world for the better. We look at maybe the rise of Islam, They have a bit of an idea, but not the full picture. They don't have salvation, which is a terrible weakness. So what you see here is a lesson that you see everywhere. Who would have thought that within 300 years, a bunch of slaves and fishermen and wasters from Jerusalem running away would completely transform the Roman Empire? From the time of Christ, it was only 300 years before the Roman Empire officially recognized Christianity as its religion of faith. All the gods that Paul wrestled with in Corinth and in Athens, and they had lost their power in the Roman Empire. Well, the Roman Empire had been going for, almost 1,000 years at that point, and dominated the world. So, we need not be afraid. Yeah, we may be small, like Gideon's army, and we may feel weak. We may be weak in many ways, but we have God with us. Yeah. That's the first point. James says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Even the devil, and I'm not suggesting that you start a war with the devil. Moses thought it was a foolish thing, and the angel Gabriel thought it was a foolish thing. But if you resist the devil, he'll flee from you, says James. So even the most powerful of the supernatural world of evil will flee from a Christian who resists and trusts in Jesus Christ. That's a thought. Which is what James is highlighting there. Any thoughts on that? It's intriguing how quickly it collapses, isn't it? And we're always surprised. We're surprised when civilizations collapse. We're surprised when huge enemies collapse.
They're fighting against themselves, as the Midianites are.
That does happen. Yeah. Yeah. Because there's nothing at the centre. This becomes the problem. If you've nothing at the centre that holds you together, apart from greed and power, eventually it can't hold. The centre can't hold. Yeah? Unless you have something a lot stronger, the centre can't hold. It'll survive for a while. So you could find for a while people can work together, especially if they're fighting against something that they consider or fighting something that they consider vital and important. But if there's nothing at the centre, in the end, it just collapses. Second then, so off they head off and they start running down the Jordan Valley, heading south. Now, Gideon sends messengers ahead. So there are obviously some fast runners, some messengers. And so in chapter 7, verse 24, they call out the men of Ephraim. Now the Ephraimites, so at the moment, it's mainly the northern tribes that are involved in this. And so as they go down the Jordan Valley, they move towards what is the Dead Sea, and the hills are certainly on the Mediterranean side of the River Jordan are dominated by the very, very large tribe of Ephraim. It's the largest of the tribes, and by far the most dominant of the tribes. So they send messengers down to the tribes of Ephraim and say, come down out of the hills, because that is hill country. Come out of the hills and take the waters. In other words, come up the River Jordan and take control. Yeah, take control of. So what they're calling for reinforcements to go ahead of the fleeing, to meet the fleeing soldiers. Yeah, they're cutting off the retreat. In battle terms, they're cutting off the retreat of the Midianites. So the tribe of Ephraim come up the River Jordan and meet them. Remember, this is a huge army. They had more camels. Let me tell you, they're taking their camels with them. They came. They didn't. They're not going home without their camels and their wealth. So they have to stay down the Jordan River, and the tribe of Ephraim meet them. And of course, they capture. We're told that they capture a couple of the commanders, Zeb and Oreb, who seem to be key Midianite leaders, and they're killed. And then Gideon catches up, and the Ephraimites are very upset. Pride's raising its head. Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us earlier on? We're the key tribe. We are the important people. We are the soldiers. We are the fighters. We have some, why were we not involved? Well, the reality is that they weren't invited to the party because God didn't invite them. And God didn't invite them to the party because they're proud and arrogant, as becomes clear. Do you remember, it was reduced to 300 so that no one could boast before God and say, we did this. And you can see God's wisdom. So the tribe of Ephraim come out, and they're in a foul mood, absolutely vile mood. And they're going, why have we been called to the party so late? Why? Now, Gideon turns aside their questions with a very soft answer. He's very, what would we call it? Diplomatic. Yeah? It's diplomacy. I'm going to ask you in a moment if you think he's right. Should he have been straight with them? And he goes, you can see his answer. His answer's pouring honey, isn't it? He's just pouring honey and sweetness. What have I accomplished compared to you? A great deal, but we'll not talk about that at the moment. What have I accomplished? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes, what you've left behind, better than anything I can gather? God gave you Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders. What could I do compared to you? And they suck all this up, don't they? They're suckers for a bit of, what do you call it, soft soaping? Is that what you call it? Yeah? They're a sucker for a bit of soft soap. And at this, their resentment against him subsided. Oh, dear. Do you know, it's one of the curses, isn't it, of working in churches and anywhere, really. People who think they're something, and then they're not included, and then they're in a terrible huff because they're not included, and it can just spoil everything. Instead of rejoicing in what God has done and is doing, the Ephraimites, why am I not at the front? Why am I not leading? Why am I not? Why didn't you call me in? I could have saved the day. It's a terrible thing when you see it, and I'm sure in your lifetimes you've seen it, because I've definitely seen it more than once, and Gideon deals with them very softly, and he recognizes the good that they've done, and he praises them for it, and acknowledges that their contribution is important. But he doesn't say God didn't invite you to the party till late on because you take the glory for yourself. He didn't say that. Do you think he should have done? He did what he did.
They need to know.
Well, they need to know. It lays down problems ahead. There are problems that lie ahead in the years that lie ahead. So that's what he did.
I wonder if they would have been so ready to join in before the victory then. They were going to face all those. They'd be ready then to.
Well, what's obvious is that these 150 odd thousand, 100,000, whatever thousand, had marched through their territory up to the Jordan just a month earlier, if that, and they hadn't stopped them. So the Ephraimites, and they'd watch this army, because that's the only way the army could go. The Midianites would have to go up because of the sheer number and the sheer weight of animals and the need for water for their camels. That's why you're told there's a lot of camels. They need to water their camels. So they would have gone through the Ephraimite, and the Ephraimites never did anything, no. They're jumping on the bandwagon as the victory is declared. It is a horrible thing, pride, isn't it? And arrogance, and it could well have derailed the work. If Gideon had responded in a different way, if he'd been less diplomatic, if he'd responded in a different way, that the whole thing could have turned into a civil war, or laid seeds for a future civil war. It's interesting, the Bible sometimes doesn't say anything. It just tells you what happens, and it makes no comments. It doesn't comment on whether Gideon was right or wrong. That's what he did. It is, yeah. I think it's a lesson to us, when God is blessing, if we're not included, then we should rejoice in what God is doing. We know what it's like, and we know what it's like when someone's being successful and you haven't, or someone's doing something and God has blessed it and you've not been involved, and he's not quite blessing you in the same way he's blessing someone else, and you a kind of pride sometimes rises, sometimes always rises, and you think, well, why hasn't God involved me? It might be this answer. It might not be your time. Any thoughts around that? It's intriguing, isn't it? Okay, so the Midianites are heading south down the River Jordan. The Ephraimites meet them. If you look at the map, what happens is they then take a sharp left turn up into the hills. So they realize they're vulnerable. The Midianites realize they're vulnerable in the valley bottoms. They realize that the Ephraimites are going to control that. So they head off into the hills, which is why the text doesn't really pick it up in the same way. But when it says that Gideon, 300 men continued, and they pursued them, and the men of Sukkoth. Sukkoth is nowhere near it's up in the hills on the opposite side to the Mediterranean of the River Jordan. Do you know what I mean? It's on the I guess it's Jordan. I reckon it's modern day. It would be modern day Jordan, up into the hills and into the deserts. And so he comes to two towns. Okay, now these are two towns that are going to sit on the fence. As they head up into the hills, Gideon and his 300 men continue the pursuit. Intriguingly, Ephraim are not with them at this point. And they're still chasing 1,500 men. And weary, they ask the towns of Sukkoth and Peniel for food. These are the tribes of Gad. Now, the history of the tribes of Gad was when they started to take the promised land, the tribes of Gad wanted to stay on the west of the River Jordan. You know, they were quite happy with the land on the west of the River Jordan. And the agreement was that if the people on the east of the River Jordan, the other main tribes, would continue to keep them involved in the nation, and that God would remain part of the nation though they were divided by the river. Okay, so there's a couple of things you can read about it in I think probably the Deuteronomy and Joshua, and you see this agreement that's broken, and in fact they built a big stone pillar and made an altar and a sacrifice, and agreed always to work together, yeah, so that Israel would not become two nations split by a river. So Gideon gets across. Now this is another generation, a few generations have passed, but the principles stand. And these 300 men are pursuing the 1,500 that are left of the Midianite army. And when they get to these cities, both cities in essence say, we're going to wait and see who wins. Well, that's in essence what they're saying. They say, help us. They say, well, when you have the kings, have you got the kings? No. Well, we're going to wait and see who the winners are, and then we're going to make our decision. That's in essence their thinking and their argument. And not wanting to be seen as favouring anyone, we're not going to give you any bread or any food in case you lose. Because there's only 300 of you and 1,500 have just passed by, and we know who's going to win this war, and we want to make sure that we're on the side of the winners. They don't believe that these 300 men are capable of fulfilling the plan that the Lord has given them. And while the tribe of Ephraim were upset not to be involved, the tribe of Gad were waiting to see who's victorious. They were not guided by a godly principle. They were guided by circumstances. So they weren't guided by the principles. The principle that these are fellow Jews, the principles that they're in an agreement with these fellow Jews. They're not guided by that. They're not guided by these are God's people. What they're guided by is who's going to win, the circumstances. It's not what's right that matters, but who's winning, as far as these two cities are concerned. I think it's always a danger in days of great uncertainty and conflict that we hedge our, what we'd say we hedge our bets. I'm not entirely sure what it means, but it's an ism, isn't it? It's I guess you're just careful who you make your allegiances with. But the Bible tells us that Christians must make their allegiances with God and God's people, and not with the world, not hedge their bets. And in a day of danger and uncertainty, and maybe a day like ours, when the church seems so strong and the world seems so big, you see people and they want one foot in the world and one foot in the church, and they spend their lives trying to navigate having what the world offers and having what the church offers. Now, sometimes the two go together quite happily, but sometimes a decision has to be made, and sometimes we don't make the right decisions. Can you see what's happening here? Yeah, in the text, you see. And any thoughts on that? Any comments? We do the same thing. Yeah. We are. I mean, let's not cast the first stone, eh? Yeah, definitely. I think so. I think. Yeah, we. What is right? We're being told what language we're allowed to use and what we're allowed to say, and someone else is defining our language. Someone else is defining what we describe as right and wrong. Do we go with the world's view, or do we go with God's view? And that's what we have to wrestle with. And that's what we are wrestling with. To do so in a generous and a kind way, but a firm way, in a clear way, you know. And we are wrestling with these questions today, very much so. We'll do more so in the days that lie ahead. Yeah.
You can understand why these tribes refuse to feed them.
Oh yeah.
They were thinking of their own necks.
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm not too I'm critical of Gad, but not too, because remember, these are the ones that are on the very edge of the country. So these are it's them, desert, and enemy. That's it. They're not. It's not them and another tribe and then another tribe and then the enemy. It's them. They're the last frontier. So they're making their decision because they know that their borders the enemy. Yeah, they're definitely on the front line.
I wonder what they thought though when they saw all those Midianites running away from Gideon's little group of men.
Yeah.
Didn't they think, well, how is this happening?
Yeah. There was a lot happening there that they should have been taking, and also they didn't offer to go with Gideon, so they're not. Yeah. I think we understand where they're wrong, but we kind of also have some sympathy with their position. Gideon doesn't, which we'll come to him now in a minute. Yeah. I think so. I think it's really hard. So a modern day equivalent would be for a doctor today. So Christians becoming a doctor today and going through the training process of being a doctor and having to go through all the policies and all the practices and some of the things that are being pushed through the government about end of life, about abortion and things like that. What do they do? What does a modern day Christian doctor do? Where do they take their stand? Historically, they've been given freedom of conscience so that they can say, no, not me. See? That's historically. That is being weakened. Yeah. Let me give you another example. Again with a doctor, I visited some friends in Ukraine, and there was a young lady in the church, a believer, a Christian in the church, and she was a doctor. Now, for someone proclaiming to be a Christian to go through university and become a doctor in Ukraine hasn't happened very often over the last 80 years. Christians have been pushed out. So it's quite a remarkable thing she's done, and she's obviously got great abilities. They placed her in her area was really a series of high-rise flats. There's lots of these post-Soviet, these Soviet blocks, a series of high-rise flats, and she was the GP for that series of high-rise flats. Her pay is minimal. She's basically paid the same as the worker in the tractor factory. Okay? How they survived, the GPs survived, was that people would come to see the GP with a box of eggs, some vegetables, because the GPs weren't in a position to work a farm. Most people would have a garden or a farm, and they could take care of themselves with their garden and their farm, and they'd have food for winter. But the GPs weren't in that position. They didn't have that opportunity. So how the GPs survived was that people would bring them food, But it was, in essence, not a bribe, but an untaxed payment. What's she to do? What's she to do? If you said, so for a Westerner, you'd go, she shouldn't take that untaxed payment of chickens and eggs and vegetables and, But to survive, her wage won't pay her bills. It's hard, isn't it? It's hard. If we think it's easy to, it's not easy. Very difficult. Interestingly, the church leaders, or the older church members who had been through 3 decades of persecution, were of the opinion that she should set her course even if it meant she looked like she would starve and God would provide. So that was their position. Yeah, because of what they experienced. This was the church who had 3 people prepare sermons for a Sunday in case 2 of them were arrested. At least one of them would have a message. All right, so that's the church mentality. Very hard. Yeah. Right. Lastly, victory. Gideon and his army take a shortcut, and you see that as you read it. So you're told that they went and they found a route of the nomads, verse 11. There's already been a terrible price paid. And then verse 11, they went via the route of the nomads, and east of Noba and another place. And they caught the kings. Okay, so because they're a smaller group, they don't have any camels or any of that, they're able to take a shortcut. They follow the nomadic route, and they cut off the army in its retreat, and they take the army, and certainly, most importantly, they take the 2 kings, and they capture them, and the kings are ultimately executed, and so begins 40 years of peace, which is great. However, they go back then to the cities, and one city, the leaders are punished with beatings, and another city, a tower is pulled down, and all the men are killed in it. And ultimately, Gideon kills the 2 kings because it seems almost to be an anger. Those were my brothers, he says, verse 19, sons of my own mother, as surely as the Lord lives, if you'd spared their lives. And then he said to his son, kill them, verse 20 of chapter 8. But his son was very young and didn't draw his sword. So the 2 kings taunted him, and Gideon killed them. That's interesting, isn't it? And in our day, Geneva Convention and all of that, you'd go, ooh, that wasn't right. But it's not a day of the Geneva Convention. This was a day when if people didn't take care of each other, then enemies would win. If people broke their promises, then they were punished for it. This was a day in which what the 2 cities did, in essence, was, what's the word I'm looking for? The 2 cities was traitorous, by not supporting fellow Jews, not supporting Gideon in the fight against the enemy. They were traitors to Israel, and so they were punished. Intriguingly, talking to 1 or 2 others about this, they look very badly upon Gideon. I less so, but some of the commentaries consider Gideon's actions to be out of proportion and consider Gideon's actions to be brutal. I think it's a reflection of the day and of the challenges that they faced in the day, and in a way of how law was meted out in those days. The victor really did have the spoils, and Revelation 3 tells us about the church of Laodicea. They're condemned for being neither hot nor cold. They sit on the fence. They consider themselves to be rich, having the best of both worlds, but God says they're poor. the New Testament equivalent that I could find. And God threatens to remove from them his presence. Any thoughts on this one as we kind of come to an end? It's intriguing, isn't it? I think it's hard. We do not face the battle like them. We do not face the same enemy. We're not involved in the same warfare, and we never have been. I was reminded of listening to a Second World War commentary on the Russians coming into the camps and finding the horrible, appalling extermination or concentration camps, and just killing the guards. And you think, well, justice wasn't done. But what they were confronted with and what they'd been through up to that point, and how they'd been brutalised by war, it's not right, but I kind of understand it. Yeah. Any thoughts? This is a long one, isn't it?
Yeah. I think I can see how that's how it was in those days, but when you read about a godly man like Gideon, who took the sword with no qualms at all, and that's what I find, and throughout the Bible I know that
It is,
godly
yeah.
men,
Yeah.
and I know God's hand is in it, but it is hard.
It is hard, and he was the executor of God's justice in a way. So there are kind of a couple of ways to look at this. One was that as the judge, because he was the judge. This is the book of the Judges. He was the judge appointed by God to be God's executor of justice, which is what the judge does. The judge executes justice. So he does execute justice. The justice he executes is harsh by modern standards. But then they didn't have prisons. Israel didn't have any prisons at all. No one had prisons in those days. You were punished. And if your crime was equivalent to a modern day life sentence, you were killed. I mean, and that's been the way, I think, probably the majority of human civilization, from what I can see. Not many people, not many places had prison systems as we do. That's almost Victorian, isn't it? It's kind of Victorian.
Well, God didn't hesitate to drown all those Egyptians, did he?
No.
He set an example.
Yeah.
This is how I get rid of the people who are not
Yeah.
following me. And,
Yeah.
and read the book of Jeremiah, and it's nothing but God's curse on the different cities
Yeah.
because they have not done what he wanted them to do. They're worshipping idols.
Yeah.
And he can wipe them out.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your word, and we pray that you would help us to wrestle with it and understand it. Amen.